My father always used to say that to whom much is given, much will be required, and that I think we were very much raised with the sense that a privileged upbringing, but there is a sense of responsibility that comes with it, and it's not just yours to do with as you wish.
Welcome to the Legacy Project. My name is Jim Copple, president of the Servant Forge Foundation. We're an organization committed to leadership development with a specific focus on service. This podcast and its related activities are about sharing the legacy we have inherited and discussing the legacy we still want to create. Legacy is more than cars, houses, boats, and material possessions that we want to leave to the next generation. Rather, legacy is about core values and beliefs that we inherited from a previous generation. They are the values that shaped us and defined us. Legacy is also about the values we develop or create that can be passed on or shared with the next generation. We will interview people from various backgrounds and walks of life. Some are famous, some, well, maybe not so famous, and others are simply our neighbors, our friends, people who live ordinary lives doing extraordinary things. Become part of this project by being intentional about legacy, more than just memories, but principles that have guided our lives and shaped our decisions. What is the legacy you choose to create? That's what we want to discover.
Catherine, thank you for participating in this interview and this podcast, and thank you for being in Nairobi, Kenya to help us on our police initiative.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for asking me to be involved.
Part of what we do in our podcast is trying to understand the key influences in a person's life, what helps shape their background, what kind of legacy they've inherited, and the kind of legacy that they want to transmit to the next generation or to friends, colleagues, professionals. And I'm just kind of curious in getting to know you. What were the key influences in your life? Who shaped and defined who you are?
Yeah, well, it sounds like a cliche, but I would have to say my parents, key influences. We grew up in Oxfordshire in England, but my parents are both American, and they'd come over in the 70s. So we didn't have any cousins or aunts and uncles or extended family, no grandparents. So my siblings, I'm one of 5, and my parents, we were a very close family. And I think also being American in a British society, some of the values and influence that your parents and your family environment create were more unique and maybe stood out a little bit more to me than the society in which I was living. And then I think the other main influence growing up was our gardener. Actually, he passed away about 3 years ago at the age of 92, and he'd come to the house in the 1920s when he was about 14 years old. Oh. So I should explain, it's a English country house, and when my parents bought it in the 70s, this gardener Jack was still there and been there, as I said, since the 20s. And he lived in a little cottage on the estate and was just one of the most amazing, humble men that I've ever had the privilege of knowing. And he had never been married, didn't have any children. And so it was like two families had been brought together to fit the perfect hole in each other's lives. We had no grandparents and no extended family, and neither did he. And so he would come in every evening for supper. He would babysit for us and was essentially our grandfather growing up, and was just one of those gentle spirits that you don't find often anymore. Lived a very simple, humble life. Had left Britain maybe twice in his life. Once was for the war, and once was when my parents decided to take him with us to America for a summer holiday and put him on a bus in LA on the Greyhound bus and said, we'll pick you up in DC in a month's time.
My word.
So poor Jack, who'd barely left the county or the village, did this amazing trip, but he spoke about it for the rest of his life, and it was one of the best experiences he ever had. So yeah, I'd say those three are my key.
In those relationships, obviously with your parents, let's start with them. What are some of the key values you took out of their relationship? What were they teaching you?
Well, from my mother, I'd say the key value was love and compassion and family and caring for people and being understanding and empathetic and slow to judge. From my father, I think there was the value of working hard, and this is, I think, a very typical American value, especially he'd come from sort of 2 or 3 generations of immigrants. So his grandfather had come from Scotland to Northern Ireland. His father had moved from Northern Ireland, was born in 1905 in Belfast, worked in the docks, emigrated to America. And then my father was born in the States and then came back to the UK. And I think in every one of those generations that was passed down, that you can make your life better and you can work hard. But also with that came a sense of responsibility and obligation, and that it's not just your hard work, it's also blessing and it's a gift from God. And my father always used to say that to whom much is given, much will be required. And that I think we were very much raised with the sense that it's a privileged upbringing, but there is a sense of responsibility that comes with it, and it's not just yours to do with as you wish. Dad always used to quote, I think it's Kierkegaard, it might have been him. No, it wasn't, but I forget who it was, but who said, I'm going to paraphrase, I don't know why we're here, but I know it's not just to have a good time.
Yeah.
So, this sense
that sounds like Kierkegaard.
sense of giving back,
yeah,
and stewarding what you have and what you've been blessed with. And then Jack, I think that the values of simplicity and humility and not needing to have a lot. He was just so happy and so content and so peaceful, working outside every day until he was 90 years old, loving nature, loving being outside, seeing God's creation and everything that he did. Mm-hmm. And then he'd also sort of randomly quote poetry. He knew reams of poetry from Omar Khayyam to Tennyson to all sorts, and he was constantly quoting Kipling, and so he was the sort of philosopher gardener who had these lovely simple values.
Well, you're involved in agriculture now, right?
Mildly, yeah.
Mildly.
I dabble.
Did he have an influence on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm still in the same house where I grew up, and I'm actually living in his cottage that he lived in. Yeah, the closeness to the earth, the caring for it, the love of animals, but without being too sentimental. That we have a responsibility and an obligation to look after the natural world. He always used to say, though, that a whistling woman and a crowing hen are no good to God nor men, whenever I was whistling. And it took me until I was about 20 to figure that one out, because I never understood when I was about 10 years old what on earth he meant by a crowing hen. But I got there in the end.
Well, I might add for our audience, you may occasionally hear a crowing hen. We're in Nairobi, and we have hens next to us, and so occasionally they crow. I'm going to go back to a minute, something in terms of what your parents taught you related to caring for others, and sort of the tension between duty and compassion, or duty and love. Was it more out of a sense that because much has been given and that much may be required, that it's our duty, or is it born more out of a sense of compassion or love? Or is it both?
Yeah, I think it's both, and I think it's also a sense that you don't want to waste the gifts and the talents and the assets that you've been given, and that there is an obligation to use what we've been given in a way that helps others. I don't think my parents were saying that you've been given this and you need to go out and make even more money from what you've been given. It was more a sense that you have this lovely house and these fields, and it's not just yours to use as you want. You know, we're going to have friends to come out and walk in the woods. We're going to have the Boy Scouts come and do their camping. We're going to have homeless charities come and use the garden. So it's very much a sense that it isn't just ours to keep. And yeah, so I think a sense of duty, but also recognition that that it comes from God. That it's not through our own hard work. Yes, to a certain sense it is. And my father started a company and has worked very hard, but there's also a lot of I think, recognition by my parents that there is blessing as well in there.
Mm-hmm. So Stephen Covey wrote a book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The second habit is living with the end in mind, and where he imagines, and something of a depressing question, was that if people were to attend your funeral today, what would they say about you? And then imagine what people would say about you 10 years from now if you had an opportunity to shape it. And so I'm going to project out 10 years from now in terms of who you are, what you do, what you're engaged in. What would you like people to say about you?
From a personal perspective, I would like people to think I'd been a good friend, faithful friend, and had done whatever I could if people I knew had needed anything. So I think compassionate would be one, kind. And from a professional point of view, I think I would like to know that I've done something to make a difference, not necessarily changing the world, but doing what I could in whatever small way that I can, which is one of the reasons I'm thrilled to be part of this police summit and police reform. So yeah, I think those are the sort of two things that I would say I'd like to know I've done.
So in terms of the sort of your professional work, director of Oxford Analytica
Foundation.
Yeah. Excuse me.
My brother will get upset if you take his job from him.
I can understand that. Okay, the distinction between the two at the foundation and the scholarly work that you do and the kind of policy work that you do, to what extent do your values influence your work and the kind of engagements that you're involved in, like this project? I know you've been involved in policing projects elsewhere, and you've done a number of different things professionally. To what extent do those values have influence?
I think one of the key values that we were raised with, having, I think, been Americans growing up in Britain and my father coming out of the Nixon administration, was a sense that you don't want to get too involved in the weeds when it comes to politics. And by that I mean that you can often be wiser and more effective if you have a bit of an arm's length approach to things that are going on, whether it's politics or personal relationships. So the value, I would say, is of not being too quick to judge, to look at both sides of an argument. There's a quote, I can't remember who said it, but a liberal is a man who never takes his own side in an argument or something like that. So I think, we were just raised with a sense of, take a step back and look and make you can have value judgments, but don't be too quick to come to those judgments and hear all the sides of a story. And I think travelling also has helped that, and seeing lots of different countries and people. Again, another quote my father used to say was from Kipling, who, what knows he of England who only England knows, something along those lines, that we can't really help shape or change things if that's the only thing we've ever known, that we need to go beyond our boundaries and our comfort zones to see what else is out there in the world. And so when it comes to professional work, I think that value has stuck with me, that it's important to see the big picture, to understand all sides of the argument, to try not to see things from our own preconceived ideas and biases with the way that we've been raised or the countries we've been raised in. And so I think that does help me quite a lot in the work that I do, and that I don't come in, I like to think I don't come into a situation or a project with any preconceived notions, that I'm willing to listen and learn, and then working with clients to help shape the outcome based on an objective and informed understanding of the situation.
You mentioned travel. How is travel, and you've traveled all over the world, how does travel help influence or shape the values that you're developing? You kind of alluded to it, but kind of go a little bit further of how important that is in your development.
I think it's really crucial in anyone's development. Travel is what I think to me, helps keep an open mind, helps us understand cultures and people that we might not otherwise meet. And in doing that, understanding that, I think we can help shape, if we're in the field of international development, it helps us shape better responses and solutions. It stops us being afraid or ignorant or support policies in our home countries that might be based on fear. And I think it helps us really be able to defend what it is that we believe in. So once you've travelled and you've seen the world and you've seen the way other people live and the way they do things, then it's okay, I think, to say, all right, based on everything I've seen, this is what I believe in, or this is what I want to stand up for or promote or defend. If you've never done that and if you've never seen any of those other cultures, it makes it harder, I think, to legitimately say what you believe in, because otherwise you're just repeating the same principles that you've been raised with. And I think it is important to understand, I don't know, let's say, for example, why you believe in free speech or having a written constitution or whatever it is that you choose to believe in. It is very important, I think, to have travelled and seen other places and the way other people live and cultures that they have. And then you can learn to defend your position from an intelligent and informed point of view.
Does that exposure that you've had, has it influenced your values of who you are as a person?
Yeah, I think what it's done is it helps me appreciate having grown up in the West. And I think the biggest difference, I'd say even between America and Europe, is a sense of, I think, the Constitution, rule of law, and the value of the individual. And that's certainly something that has stayed with me and a value that's been cemented the more that I travel and the more work that I do. Even in America, where we take some of these values for granted, I think having been to places where people don't always have those freedoms has helped me really appreciate what we have in the States and the West. Yeah.
From an educational experience, your undergraduate work was in the United States, and you did a master's, correct, at Oxford?
Yeah.
In film, and then law school in the United States. To what extent did your educational experience, both from an American perspective and a British perspective, help shape who you've become?
That's an interesting question. The decision to go to undergraduate in the States, I'd say, was probably the most pivotal decision, the most influential decision, because it meant that I learned at a fairly young age, I was 18, about another culture. And even though my parents were American, I think going through high school in the UK, I felt probably more British than American. And then going to America was a bit of a culture shock, but after 4 years, I felt much more American than British. And I think we tend to think that growing up is all done when we're children, but when you're 18 and you leave home, that's really the first time that you have to make decisions and opinions for yourself. You're not being shaped by your parents or told what we as a family think about this or what we're going to do about this. And so at 18, you have to make your own assumptions and opinions about the world, about the values, about what you believe. So I think having that period of initial exploration of the world in America meant that a lot of how I see the world and the values that I have were shaped by America. And still with a sense of critical analysis, having come from Britain to America, I think I then sort of had this, not contention, but a sort of back and forth between, oh, well, this is how we do it in Britain, but then this is how they're doing it in America, and which side of this discussion am I going to come down on? Yeah, it was, I think, probably a very pivotal time in terms of shaping values, and it carried on even past law school and into my career as a lawyer.
So my next question is rather serious. What do you do for fun?
Well, I have this little hobby farm in Oxfordshire, which is pigs and sheep and goats and chickens. So I love spending time there, being outdoors. In the summers, I play polo. I like to shoot in the winter. I have a working dog and just rough shoot through the woods or clay pigeons, tennis. Love reading books. And travelling for fun, surfing, going to beaches.
Fiction or non-fiction, or both?
Bit of both. Mostly, I'd say, sort of classic fiction. I don't really read much past the sort of 1940s or 50s. I'm trying to make my way through Atlas Shrugged at the moment.
Oh, wow.
It's taking me a while.
I would like to do the interview again after you read Atlas Shrugged. Yeah. It's interesting. There was a movie out a couple of years ago called Leap Year, and if you've seen that movie, but in the movie there's a question being asked between the couple that's struggling in their relationship, that if there was a fire in your house and you had to leave it, what one thing would you grab?
I would take the portrait of Jack that we have that was done on his 70th birthday in the whole village. It was such a character in the village. Everybody loved him. He would bicycle around delivering the village newsletter. He would organise the carols at Christmas. He did the village handbell team. He taught archery at the village school. And for his 70th birthday, the whole village pulled together and got a professional portrait artist to paint this beautiful oil painting of him.
Oh, my.
So that's what I would take.
Yeah, that's great. So my parents are deceased, and one of the things that before they were deceased, I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and we would always joke. We would go into Mom and Dad's house, and we'd put a little sticky note on the thing that we were going to take once they were gone. And a rather morbid exercise, but it became fun over time because we were moving everybody's sticky notes around. What of your parents? What's something you would want to take that would remind you of who your parents are?
Gosh, that is a good question. I think probably one thing that springs to mind would be, either Dad's guitar, because he used to sit in the corridor in the evenings and play the guitar and sing us to sleep, or Mum has a number of, I think they're called needlepoint, when little sort of sewing pictures. And there's a lovely one that has a little bird in a house or something, and it's about family and home and the Lord. So I think it would be something like that.
Yeah. I have a box that I've had since I was 17 years old, many years ago. And inside that box are letters I've written, key events that I attended, some little artifact that I might have taken from that event. And I call it my legacy box. What would be in your legacy box?
You mentioned letters. I keep the letters that I've received from my parents. I think those would all go in there. And Mum very often just sends little postcards or notes, or will leave notes for us that just sort of word of encouragement or a verse, or just saying how wonderful she thinks we are. So I would think I would definitely leave those. Maybe some of my letters, if I could find them, that I wrote to my parents when I was travelling. And I didn't really keep diaries, but I would write letters back home, because in those days there wasn't really much internet. This was 97, I think, when I first went to Zimbabwe, and I told Mum and Dad I wasn't going to telephone them, I would only write letters. So I wrote a lot of letters my first few times in Africa, which I think would probably sum up how my life was changing through travel, things that I noticed, things that I was challenged by. For example, I do remember the first time in Zimbabwe and think, how do people live like this? And then it occurred to me, well, we can't all live. There's just not enough resources to all live the way that we live in the West. So at some point, what do you do about that? And also, I think, realising that just because people live in a simpler way and don't have electricity or running water, it doesn't mean that their lives are somehow less. And I think that these letters that I wrote back were sort of partly my processing that and learning to deal with this tension, I think, between coming from countries where we have so much and spending time in countries where they have so little, but then wanting to help and change where you can, but also recognising that they can be just as happy just because they don't have the same material things that we have. And I think that's your earlier question about travel and values. That's certainly something that has stuck with me, is that material possessions and cars and freeways and flat screen TVs is not an indicator of happiness. And just because people don't have the same material things, it is not my place to judge how happy they may or may not be.
So, in that point, you've traveled and lived and worked in extreme places and seen extreme things. What would you say about the human spirit? I mean, I'm always struck because I work in a lot of slum communities, and the resiliency of children and the smiles on their faces and the things that bring joy to them in those environments. What would you say about the resiliency of the human spirit, given the global experience you've had?
Yeah, I think, well, that ties in very nicely with the observation I was making just now, is that children especially, they don't need a lot to be happy. I think, if they've got parents that love them, if they've got stability and there's enough food, they can be incredibly happy with very little. That I think one of the dangers in the West is that we confine children too much, and we don't let them have this sort of freedom and imagination and joy that so often I see in other countries, even though the children don't have Xbox or movie screens to go and watch. It's a much simpler, I think, purer and often better upbringing for children.
That dichotomy, how do you think that shapes values?
Between materialism,
materialism and privilege versus those who don't have access, and as you said, are sometimes left to their own devices for imagination and creativity and exploration, etc.
Well, one thing I'd say, I don't have children, but I do have nephews and nieces, and I think what they learn, they've also been able to grow up in the countryside in Oxfordshire, and I think what being outside and playing helps you do is it helps the children learn to work as a team. It helps them to be responsible, to look after each other. If something goes pear-shaped, one of the older children will come back and they'll help. I think it helps with initiative and solving problems. I think it helps children to share more, because you don't have just one Xbox or one toy or one game. What my nephews argue about most and what makes them the grumpiest is when they do have screen time and then they can't have it anymore, whereas they're much happier outside. They'll climb trees all day and be very happy and jolly. I think sharing and working together, teamwork, you get a lot of values like that come from spending a little bit more time outside and having a little less material possessions.
What's your favorite book?
Probably The Count of Monte Cristo.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
Why?
I like the sense of it's been a while since I read it, but his sort of quest in life, and then the difference between justice and vendetta, and how the book sort of takes you on. He's got this journey of, he's on a vendetta, but at the end sort of learns that it's more about justice. I think that's what.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think one of the themes I've heard in our discussion is your interest in the rule of law, the interest in justice. Is that why you became an attorney or a lawyer? Or
no, I became a lawyer sort of a bit by mistake. I finished my MPhil at Oxford, and I didn't really know what else I wanted to do. I didn't want to do a job just for the sake of doing a job. I thought about doing a doctorate, but I didn't really want to delve into Chilean politics, which was my MPhil. I didn't want to do another master's, so I thought, well, law school's another option for a good graduate degree. So I came back to the States. I did 3 years. I didn't plan on being a lawyer. I summered my first summer with the UN ODC, Office of Drugs and Crime in Vietnam, and my second summer with Lehman Brothers. And then by the time I got to the end of my third year, or close to the end, I thought, gosh, well, I've spent all this time learning how to be a lawyer. I might as well just try it for a year, see what it's like. But the problem was that all the law firms had their summer associates lined up their permanent associates lined up from their summer associates. And so there weren't any firms looking. And so I just went on every sort of social media page or advertising page I could find, and there was an ad for a first-year associate in the US Virgin Islands, which I had no idea where that was. Looked it up on a map and thought, okay, great, I'll apply. So it was branch office of a US firm, and I went out there. They were a litigation firm, and I'd only done one litigation course at university, at law school, but they didn't seem to mind. I had done moot court, so I think that helped a lot. They knew I could do oral arguments. And it was kind of by mistake that I really found my passion for rule of law, because in the Virgin Islands at that time, they didn't have enough public defenders because there were so many conflicted cases, or where the defendants needed separate representation. So every private attorney out there was on a list. And when the next case came in, whether it was criminal law and family law, if the public defenders couldn't take it, it would go to the next private attorney. And it didn't matter if you were a tax attorney or we were labour and employment, you would just get the case. And so I did everything from child custody, divorce, to first-degree murder, drugs, child abuse, and all sorts of cases that if I'd been in the States, would have taken me probably years to get that level of exposure. I was in court the day after I got sworn in. I knew so little about law or litigation at that stage that the judge was asking me these questions about this. My client was a young kid for juvenile delinquency, and it's a very small community, so they knew I was a new lawyer, that I'd been sworn in the day before. The prosecuting attorney was across the room, and he would just turn over when the judge asked me a question and just give me a nod or a shake of his head and help me out. They were both of them were coaching me and explaining it. So it was a lovely sort of small community in which to practice, and great exposure. But also on the negative side, a fair bit of corruption in the police force. And this one murder case that we had, the police knew that, we didn't discover this until afterwards, but the police knew that the client was not guilty, but kind of hid the evidence or didn't turn it over. And I think that for me was really shocking, because I'd always assumed, as I'm sure most people sort of in the West assume, that the police are always without doubt there to help and protect. And I think for me that was just a real wake-up call that even in America there can be problems with rule of law, and that it is so crucial that we continue to work to help uphold it, because once your life is taken away, and thank goodness it wasn't capital punishment jurisdiction, but it's not a joke when the government kind of turns its wheels. Small people don't have a lot of recourse to stand up against it, and so for me that was something that became a really important mission in my life.
Yeah. That's leading me right into my final question. You said your mission in life. To what extent, in terms of what you're doing now, would you consider it a calling?
That's a good question. I think what I would say is that I feel called to use my gifts and my talents to the best of my ability, and to not waste what I've been given, to not waste the privilege of education and a stable family and the opportunity to travel. And for me, the rule of law is sort of where I feel that my calling and my interests intersect. That I think there are a number of ways that I a number of careers or professions that I could do that I think would be fall under what I would call a calling, but rule of law is more, I think, maybe specifically my interests. So yeah, it's probably the best of the calling options, if that makes sense.
Would you call it a passion?
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
Yeah, great, thank you. We've been talking with Catherine Young from Oxford Analytica Foundation, and also a collaborator and a partner with us on our reform efforts dealing with police corruption with the National Police Service here in Nairobi, Kenya. So thank you for being a part of this.
Thank you for having me.
To find out more information about this conversation and other Legacy podcast episodes, go to servantforge.org. Please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app and consider leaving us a review. We want to hear from you. We want to get your ideas and your opinions. I have a new book that corresponds with the Legacy Project titled The Seeker, Bring Me the Horizon. You can find a copy of it on Amazon or your preferred book distributor. The book corresponds closely with these podcasts. The podcast episode was produced by Matt Erickson and edited by Carissa Erickson. The music is by David Hyde. Please look for a new episode of our podcast coming out soon. Remember, you have inherited a great legacy. You have an opportunity to create a great legacy. Engage your past to build a future.